So here's what I was thinking, actually, while Jennifer was talking. There was a few things that came to mind. First of all, my daughter, just want to tell a very quick anecdote. My daughter was 6 years old, and she is extremely stubborn, which in fact will be amazing for her when she's a teenager and an adult, because she's going to stand her own ground. So I don't want to break her of her stubbornness or anything like that. I appreciate it. However, when we have to leave and she won't get dressed, it's a problem. So I actually used one of Jennifer's techniques before I met you, so you were connected. We were going to in downtown in the Yorkville area. They were doing all these fancy ice sculptures. And my mother-in-law was there, and we were doing a day outing to look at all these ice sculptures. Jess, put your coat on. No. Jess, put your coat on. No. So I called my husband on the side. I said, I don't really want to go to the ice sculptures. So if she doesn't do it, she just doesn't go. So I said, okay, Jess, here's the situation. Bubby and Daddy and everybody are leaving in 2 minutes in the car. They're getting in the car right now. And if your coat's not on, we're going. And I, unfortunately, will have to stay with you. Not doing it. She was literally on the ground. Not doing it! I said, okay. And they drove away. So she got up and looked out the window. She goes, where are they? I said, they left. No! I said, I told you that they were going to leave. I never said I told you so. I just said, oh my God, this must be so frustrating for you. I said, let's have a nice evening together. We'll order in some pizza. We'll do something together. I didn't punish her. She never did it again, ever. So another thing about the birthday parties, by the way, Jessie was at a birthday party 2 days ago, and the parents invited 5 kids over, and when I picked her up 2.5 hours later, she said, oh my God, that was the best party. We did nothing. The gift bag, the loot bag, was a couple of flowers from a bouquet of carnations. Best gift she got. Just a little insight there. So on that very profound note, the real profound moments are going to come now. I'm so pleased to be here today because all the information so far that Jennifer had shared with me, I'm actually going to apply to my coworkers and to the people who work for me at the Yummy Mummy Club, because I think this is an awesome way of connecting with your colleagues and treating them with respect and really acknowledging what they're hearing. Dr. Gabor Nate, I'm sure, is going to give me a whole set of other tools to understand how our children think and the medical, the physiological understanding of childhood development, and also how it affects us as adults as well. So I'm looking forward to Dr. Gabor Nate. Thank you very much for being on stage.
Thank you. Well, thank you. If you look around our country, or North America, in fact, Western civilization, from the perspective of what's happening to children and what children are manifesting, it's not a very encouraging picture. It was in Toronto last year that in June, I think, or late last school term, a 9-year-old boy in a school ended up in handcuffs. Some of you remember that story? Yeah. It was a national story. This boy had Asperger's, which is one of these conditions that more and more kids are being diagnosed with. And one of the traits of Asperger's is that these kids have trouble reading social cues, so they don't pick up on the social cues of other kids so well. So they tend to be a bit different. As such, they tend to be bullied, as I'm sure Gordon would have indicated to you yesterday. It's the kids who are different and vulnerable who get to be bullied. His response was to get upset. The teacher's response to the upset was to lock him in a room by himself. At which point, he began, I think, to act destructively, destroy the furniture, I think, at which point they called the cops. He ended up in handcuffs for about half a minute or so. A 9-year-old. grade 3. Now the debate afterwards focused on, did the police do the right thing in handcuffing him? That's what the question was today. Is that the way to handle it? That was not the right question. The right question is, why is the school system so completely bereft of understanding that the child who needs warm human contact is actually deprived of it? And because if you're going to call the police, they're going to do what the police are going to do, which is to restrain people. That's what they're trained to do. It should never have got to that point, had there been the least understanding of this child's needs in the schools. And it's not a unique example. In British Columbia, some years ago, there was a scandal because the teacher dealt with the boy's hyperactivity in the classroom by taping his head to the desk. And it was in Florida somewhere that a 6-year-old was arrested and charged with assault in kindergarten because he got upset about something and he hid under the table, and when the teachers tried to pull him out, he started kicking at them and he wouldn't come out. So they called the cops. And he was taken to jail, charged with assault. And when the New York Times reporter called the police chief of this town and said, "But this kid is only 6 years old," the police chief says, "Well, do you think this is the first 6-year-old we've arrested in this town?" Now, what does that betray? That betrays the dominant bias in understanding children, which is that the problem is the behavior. The problem is the behavior. So the way to deal with it is to control the behavior. How do you control behaviors? We control behaviors basically by punishments or by rewards. You reward the good behavior, you punish the bad. The model arose out of the Behavior School of Psychology, B.F. Skinner, who in the 1940s worked with rats. Now, if you want a rat in a laboratory cage to behave a certain way, what you do, for example, if you wish the rat to go to one end of the cage, you put some sugar cubes there. The rat will go there and eat the sugar cubes. On the other hand, if you want to stay away from another part of the cage, you will infuse some electricity into the wiring so the rat gets a shock. And that's behavior control. In B.F. Skinner's mind, of course, the mind was a black box. You couldn't see inside the mind. You didn't care about what was going on in the mind. You just cared about the external behavior. And it's true enough. You can train a rat to do this and not to do that. So it works. And B.F. Skinner actually said, give me a child and I can make anything out of him. The idea being that children are basically blank slates and you can just sort of train them into anything if you provide the right environmental inducements or environmental deterrents. But this is what makes up 80% of the parenting advice that is dished out to parents by all the experts. And I read it in the Globe, for example, there's a guy who's supposed to be a parenting expert, and it's all about behavior control. How do you control behaviors? Now, of course, when you do that, you don't really care about the rat's development or health. You just care about getting a certain behavior. You can get the behavior, but what is the impact on the rat of getting their foot shocked by electricity? Nobody wants to know about. But if you measure the rat's stress hormone levels, you'd find them high at that point, because the impact of electricity is actually physiological stress. So when we are engaging in this behavior model, we might be getting the behaviors we want. And by the way, we will get them only temporarily for reasons perhaps that Gordon Neufeld talked about, but I will reinforce today. You'll get the behaviors, but you only get them temporarily. But whether or not you get the behaviors, you're actually stressing the child. And that has a long-term impact, because the child's mind is not a black box. It has certain needs, it has certain dynamics, and it's a question of, do we respect those dynamics and do we honor those needs, or are we only concerned with the behavior? And it's fairly natural in a parenting workshop like today, but the questions that I heard, all about how do I get this behavior, how do I get that behavior? And we have to step back a bit. And there's nothing wrong with that question, because that's, as parents, that's what we deal with. But what I'm saying is that before we ask that question, let's go back and ask, what is actually going on in a child's mind? What's actually going on? So the one approach is that behavioral approach. Now the other approach is the medical one. So when we're not trying to manipulate children's behavior, then we're diagnosing them with this, that, or the other. So as you well know, the number of diagnoses, or the number of kids being diagnosed with all sorts of disorders, ADHD, the number of prescriptions for ADHD in Canada has gone up 43% in the last 5 years, according to a recent study, and they've gone up fivefold in the previous 15 years. In the United States, there are 3 million children being medicated for ADHD now, and many tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands in Canada as well. And many children are now receiving antipsychotic medications. Now just yesterday in the New York Times, or was it Thursday in the New York Times, Johnson & Johnson, one of these giant pharmaceuticals companies, was fined $1.2 billion for false marketing of a drug called risperidone. Risperidone is an antipsychotic. We give it to adult schizophrenics to control their psychoses. In the United States, there are 500,000 children getting these medications now. Not to control their psychoses, but to control their behaviors. So what we've got is this giant social experiment in the chemical control of children's brains. Canada's no better. It got to the point that in British Columbia, the BC Children's Hospital has established a special clinic just to deal with the side effects of these antipsychotic medications on kids. And the side effects include obesity, diabetes, personality changes, skin problems, metabolic syndrome. All this, by the way, is without any studies whatsoever as to what the long-term effects are on an adolescent brain of receiving antipsychotic medications. But we're so, again, deprived of information or insight as to what's happening with our kids that either we try and control their behaviors or we try and actually control their biology by means of medications. Now, incidentally, of course, the same ethic informs our policy to adults as well, so that, you know, our government right now, as you know, there's this conference of North and South American governments taking right place in Cartagena, Colombia, and all the Latin American countries are agitating for an end to the drug war. And Canada is standing firmly against that. Our government is putting more people in jail because of drugs, and we're not going to talk about relaxing our attitude towards drugs, because with that too, our attitude is it's just a behavior problem. And if it's a behavior problem, then you simply deter people by draconian punishments. So by all means then, let's increase the punishments, which is what our government is doing right now. And right now they're spending billions of dollars in building more jails or reinforcing jail facilities. At the same time, of course, as they're cutting back the budget for social programs. Now, as I'll tell you, and this is all in the belief that this is a behavior problem. It's a choice people are making. You're choosing to do this, well, you're going to suffer for it. And of course, there's a kind of logic to it, because if you're going to deprive social programs of government support, especially to kids at risk, you're going to end up with more kids in jail. You can predict it. There's a direct correlationship. And that's because nobody chooses to be an addict, and no kid chooses to be bad either. In fact, There's no such thing as a bad kid. That whole idea of bad kids is simply a moral judgment that we adults make because we don't like their behaviors. Their behaviors are inconvenient and troubling and worrisome. But what is going on in the mind of the child? What is actually going on? And how do we understand that? We often talk about this phrase, acting out. Kids are acting out. Now, if I said to you that this particular child is acting out, in your mind's eye, you would imagine a kid who is being obstreperous, oppositional, rude, aggressive. This is how we understand the phrase acting out. And that's simply because we don't know how to understand the English language. If you actually look at the phrase acting out, what does it mean? It's a very specific and very accurate phrase. It has nothing to do with bad behavior. You act something out when you don't have the words to say it in language. That's when you act it out. So in a game of charades, where you're not allowed to speak, what do you have to do to portray the message? You have to act it out. If you landed in a country where nobody spoke your language, and you had to convey that you were hungry, you would have to act it out. That's what kids are doing. They're acting something out. It's our job, as parents, as educators, as therapists, as physicians, in whatever role we stand in relationship to kids, it's our job to understand what is being acted out. Not to respond to the behavior as if the behavior was the problem, but to recognize that the behavior is actually representing something. Something is being acted out. And then we can deal with the fundamental issue. And in order to do that, we have to take our eyes off the behavior and understand the psychology of the child. So the behavioral model doesn't help us do that. The behavioral model leads us to do things like timeouts and logical consequences, or natural consequences, or tough love. And maybe Gordon said this to you yesterday, but so forgive me if I repeat it. And when him and I speak, if not on the same day together, there might be some repetition. I'll try to avoid that as much as I can. But if your partner or spouse was behaving in ways that was troubling to you, was rude to you, didn't look you in the eye. As soon as they got home, they got on the phone and talked to somebody else. Was always emailing other people, ignoring you. And if you went to your friends to complain about that, would your friends say to you, "Have you tried timeout? How about tough love? How about natural consequences?" They would say to you, "You don't have a behavior problem. What you've got? You got a relationship problem." It's the same with our kids. Pretty much what our kids are acting out is a relationship problem. Now, so you have these two models. You have the model of behavioral understanding of kids, and then you have the medical model, which says that these kids have diseases. Like ADHD is a disease. Depression is a disease. Anxiety is a disease. Autism is a disease. And then, being a disease, it's got a biological basis. And having a biological basis, all we can do is to work with the biology. That's what it leads us to. And by the way, I'm not against medications. And I'll tell you right now, I've been diagnosed with ADHD myself, as have a couple of my kids. And I don't think it's a disease, and I don't think it's genetic. And I'll be talking a little bit about this morning, not because I want to give you a seminar on ADHD, because it's a perfect example for me to convey to you the current information on child brain development. So we either have a behavior problem or we have a disease problem. But there's a third way to understand human beings, and I think the only way to understand human beings. And that may be called a biopsychosocial perspective, one fancy word, biopsychosocial. What does that mean? It means that the biology of human beings is, for a lifetime, shaped by and affected by people's psychological and social relationships. Now, I'll begin by giving you 3 examples of that. So, a whole number of studies have shown now that children whose parents are stressed are more likely to have asthma. So the more stressed the parents are, the more likely the kid is to have asthma. And in polluted areas where asthma is obviously more common because the contaminated air aggravates the airways, aggravates the child's breathing apparatus, it's still the parents who are stressed whose kids are most likely to have the asthma. Now, if you ask the average medical doctor, explain that study, what's that all about? They really have a hard time with it because medicine separates the mind from the body. Western medicine separates the mind from the body. So we don't consider emotional factors in the onset of illness. And yet I'll be telling you that all chronic health conditions are actually related to emotional states and particularly to what happens to people in childhood. So who gets cancer, who gets asthma, who gets multiple sclerosis, these are not accidental events. They have to do with childhood experiences. Because the biopsychosocial perspective says that the biology of human beings is shaped for a lifetime by the psychological and social environment. So a Canadian study here in Toronto actually, less than 2 years ago showed that if you abused as a child, your risk of cancer as an adult goes up almost 50%. Now, and this is after you've controlled for such factors as smoking or inactivity or other lifestyle issues. Biopsychosocial. Now, if you look back to the case of the child who's asthmatic, if anybody here has been treated for asthma, you know that how we treat asthma is with inhalers. So what happens in asthma is you get narrowing of the airways, so the bronchi, which are the airways, are surrounded by a smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle goes into spasm, so the airways narrow, and now you have air flowing through a narrowed tube, so you have the labored wheezing of the asthmatic. Making things worse is inflammation. So the airways get inflamed, they swell up, internally there's debris which further obstructs the flow of air. How we treat asthma is by means of inhalers that, number one, open up the airway, they relax those muscles, bronchodilators they're called, and furthermore we treat them with inhalers that suppress the inflammation so the airways can again be more open and conduct the flow of air. What you may not know is that the bronchodilator, the inhaler that opens up the airways, is actually a copy of adrenaline. And the anti-inflammatory is a corticosteroid, it's a copy of cortisol. Now, what are adrenaline and cortisol? Anybody here know? They're stress hormones. Adrenaline and cortisol are the stress hormones manufactured by the adrenal gland. Renal means kidney, adrenal means on top of the kidney. So the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney here on both sides. It sets off, or it releases a number of hormones, primarily the hormone named after it, adrenaline. And just like the brain, the adrenal gland has a cortex. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. And so the adrenal gland also secretes a hormone named after the cortex called cortisol. And cortisol and adrenaline are the hormones that our body, through the adrenal glands, secrete when you're stressed. So if I were to stress you right now, threaten you, or just emotionally upset you, your adrenal gland would be secreting adrenaline and cortisol, which would help you increase your heart rate, more energy, more oxygen to the muscles and to the brain. It would increase your blood pressure so that you're stronger. It would elevate your sugar levels so that you have more energy to fight or to escape. And those are the hormones that we treat asthma with. Now, what's actually happened here is that the normal stress response mechanism of the child whose parents are stressed has become exhausted. And now we have to give them extra stress hormones to keep their airways open. So that when children are overstressed, their natural stress response mechanism gets exhausted. Now keep that in mind, because if you look at which is the medication that's used most commonly in all of medical practice for eczema, for psoriasis, for asthma, for multiple sclerosis, for colitis, for Crohn's disease, for rheumatoid arthritis, for certain kind of cancers, what is it? It's cortisol, the stress hormone. But my profession never asks itself, if we're using stress hormones to treat everything, maybe stress has something to do with it? You know, it's an obvious question. And those mechanisms are set early in childhood, by the way. Those mechanisms are set early in childhood. So I'll be saying more about that towards the end of the day. But right now I'm just demonstrating for you the biopsychosocial model, which is to say that the biology is affected by the psychological and social environment. Now, this is in childhood. Is it true in adulthood? Well, you look at an Australian study, 500 women who had breast lumps suspicious for cancer. So they had to be biopsied. And before the results came back, there was a psychological interview, and after the results were collated, it turned out that if a woman had a major stressful episode in her life prior to the onset of that lump, that had zero effect on whether that lump was cancerous or not. Furthermore, if a woman was emotionally isolated, that also had zero effect. None at all. Okay. But if a woman had been emotionally isolated and had suffered a major stress in her life, the risk of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. Now the researchers, being trained medical scientists, couldn't figure this one out, because their logical brain said, logically enough, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? But that's because they don't get the biopsychosocial nature of phenomena. Now, if you, sir, were very stressed right now by something, your adrenal gland would put out the cortisol and the adrenaline, and your blood pressure would be high. By the way, what is the medical term for high blood pressure? Does anybody know? We think we don't know what causes high blood pressure. It's so laughable. It's almost laughable. What's the medical name for high blood pressure? Anybody know that? Hypertension. Think about it. Hypertension. These people have too much tension in their lives. That's why they have high blood pressure. Now, this is good in the short term because it helps you escape or to fight back. But in the long term, it damages the body. It causes heart disease, high blood pressure, strokes, and so on. Cortisol, in the long term, causes ulcers, makes you heavier on the belly so that you have more risk of heart disease, thins your bones, depresses you, and suppresses the immune system. So again, to come back to my example here, if a person here is stressed and they're all by themselves, they're emotionally isolated, nobody to talk to, and you've been in a situation where something's really upsetting you, and you keep thinking about it, and you keep thinking about it, you can just tell, you can feel the tension and the physiological disturbance in your body. And if there's nobody there to talk with, because you're emotionally isolated, it's going to be like that for months. So for months you're going to stew in your own stress juices. But that suppresses your immune system. No wonder that lump has a greater risk of turning cancerous, as compared with if somebody that you knew and trusted and had some empathy and intuition came and said, "Hey buddy, how you doing?" Puts a hand on your shoulder, Do you want to talk about it? What happens to you physiologically? Immediately, your physiology changes. Your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down, you take a deep breath, oxygen goes to your brain. And physiologically, you're back in balance within a second. So that's why people who are emotionally isolated are more likely to fall ill. And lots of studies have shown that, by the way, that people who are emotionally isolated are more likely to fall ill. Which means to say that emotional contact is actually essential for health. And if this is true of children and adults, it's also true of old people. So there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine just a few years ago that showed that in an elderly couple, if one of them is hospitalized, what do you suppose happens to the other one? They're more likely to fall sick, because the immune system of the one depends on the psychological and social relationship with the other. And that's just simply the biopsychosocial point of view. It's not controversial, it's straightforward, and yet it's completely ignored in medical practice. And it's completely ignored in pediatrics and in how we treat children. And yet the situation is that if this is true for adults in midlife or at the end of life, how much more is it true for children? Because the importance of psychological and social relationships in modulating your biology increases as your level of maturity decreases. So the more immature you are, the more you're dependent. And that's why infants who are fed but never picked up will actually die. They literally will stress themselves to death. And in the orphanages in Ceausescu's Romania, when they looked at these, because in Romania, under the Ceausescu dictatorship, abortions were not legal, and birth control was not all that well available. So, and it was terrible poverty. So people kept having children that they couldn't look after. So many children ended up in these terrible state-run orphanages where there was a very poor adult-to-child ratio. Well, sure enough, when you measured the cortisol levels of these kids, they were really elevated. But let me tell you a frightening statistic. In American studies, they looked at the cortisol levels of kids in daycares, and they were higher than the cortisol levels of the same kids at home. So that, although the Romanian example is an extreme case, we're also stressing kids in our society by the lack of relationship with adults. Because the more dependent you are, the more immature you are, the more you're requiring those psychological social relationships to maintain your internal physiological and biological balance. So that's the key here. Which also means that just to look at children and say that there's something wrong with their brain biology without looking at the psychological and social environment is to ignore the most important determinant of what's happening with them. And when we develop programs like the Universal Kindergarten Program or the Day-Long Kindergarten here in Ontario, which introduced much fanfare a couple of years ago, but we don't actually look at the attachment context, we're actually ignoring those children's biology. This is not going to be a rant against daycare, because in today's society, people have often no choice. Two parents are needed to make a living. But let's not pretend that we're not paying a cost. And let's at least compensate for it by understanding what's going on. Then perhaps we could mitigate and even prevent some of the ill effects. But the effects are biological. So if we're looking at all these kids that are being diagnosed with all these disorders right now, all the hundreds of thousands of children being doled out this or that medication, we know that whatever's going on can't be genetic, because genes don't change in a population over 5 years or 15 years or even 50 years. Let me tell you another statistic. In the 1940s in Canada, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis was 1:1. So for each woman diagnosed, so was a man. You know what the gender ratio now is? It's 3 or 4 women to every man. Now we know that can't be genetic, because genes don't change over 70 years. We also know it can't be the diet or the climate, because that hasn't changed more for one gender than the other. Something's going on. And as I'll tell you later, that's something is stress. But if women are stressed, kids are stressed. So, if I tell you the statistic that in Windsor, Ontario, in 2008 or 9, and I forget which year, the number of adolescent visits for mental health disorders went up 50% in 1 year. Would you have any clue as to why that might have happened? Why Windsor? What's that? 2008 or 2009, one of those 2 years. What's that? It's the recession. It's the recession. So that there's this economic crisis, the parents are stressed, the kids get diagnosed and medicated. This is how it works, you see. Because we don't understand the connections. We don't look at the connections. Now, as certainly Gordon would have driven home to you yesterday, the most important dynamic in human life is attachment. And attachment is the seeking of closeness and proximity with another human being. Now, we seek closeness and proximity not just so that we can feel good. I mean, it does feel good, which is why we seek it, that's on a subjective level, that's why we seek it, but that's not why nature puts it in there. We seek attachment because it's the only thing that sustains human life. So it's the most important dynamic in human life. This little infant here would not survive a day without the attachment figures being close, nurturing and protecting and providing emotional support. As a species, human beings would not have survived. I mean, contrary to the... I was in my hotel room last night, and on global television, apparently, I don't know if this program exists in BC, but there's something called the Lang and Lee Report or something, a program. It's a woman and a man talking. Sorry? Lang and Leary, is it? Lang and Leary, okay. And it was just a little advertising for the program. I didn't see the program itself, but the guy says, entrepreneurs on capitalism are what's necessary to keep life going everywhere in the world. That was the phrase. I wrote it down. I thought it was brilliant. It's going to go in my next book. Because, of course, human survival had nothing to do with entrepreneurs and capitalism. It had to do with cooperation. It had to do with attachment. We would not be here. We would not be here if people were all trying to slit each other's throats, figuratively or literally. We would not be here if people always tried to exploit each other. We could not have survived as a species. We survived as a species because we had attachment dynamics that drew us together in cooperative groups. So whether you're talking about the species or the infant, there's no life without attachment. There's no life without attachment. And that means that large parts of our brain are dedicated to nothing but maintaining our attachment relationships. And the part of the brain that has attachments as its fundamental purpose is much more powerful and much more influential in our lives than our thinking apparatus. In fact, thinking is very much conditioned by our attachment relationships. So that attachment is the fundamental dynamic. It also follows, since it's the fundamental dynamic, and it's not hard to prove, I mean, just ask yourself, what is the worst thing you can possibly imagine in your life? Is it the Toronto Maple Leafs losing another season? Is it loss of a job? Or is it the loss of the people that you're close to? Because the attachment dynamic is the most important one we have for a lifetime. And that means when they go wrong, when the attachment relationships are troubled, skewed, unbalanced, or traumatic, that means that has a huge impact on our development, a huge impact on our functioning, and also on our physical health for a lifetime. And that's simply the biopsychosocial perspective. That also means that when we're dealing with kids, really dealing with anything, but especially with children who are so dependent and who are so shaped by the environment, when things go wrong, don't ask what's wrong with the kid. Let's look at the environment. Let's look at what's going on in the family. Let's look at what's going on in the culture. Let's look at what's going on in the community. And particularly, what is going on in the child's immediate relationships with the one that he or she is closest to. Which means to say that we have to look at ourselves. Now, there was an example here, even, the therapist who asked about these parents who are so upset with their child. And not to single you out, but it was a really great example. You said, I'm so angry with these parents who would throw their child away. The phrase was something along those lines. Well, those parents are not trying to throw their child away. They simply are so frustrated they don't know what to do. They're full of grief and anger and sadness. We have to understand that. Get into their dynamics so that we can help them help their child. And that's why I asked her, well, what do you feel? I've been in the same situation. It's not like her experience is different from mine. But I know that when I'm angry myself, that anger is communicated unconsciously to whoever I'm dealing with. And that has a much bigger impact than any words that I'm uttering at the same time. Now, if this is true for her and I as adult trained health professionals, think of what it's like for a kid to receive the anger and frustration of the parent. What does that make them feel like? But again, we're just trained to look at their behaviors. So if you take something like oppositionality, did Gordon speak about oppositionality yesterday? Yes, no? A little bit? Okay. Well, I'll say more about it later, but let's say we talk about the oppositional child. In fact, there's this diagnosis called oppositional defiant disorder. Let's think about that for a moment. Does it even exist? Is there such a thing as an oppositional defiant child? We think that once we made a diagnosis, we've explained something, but we haven't explained anything. To call a kid ADD might describe his behavior, but you haven't explained anything. You just described a bunch of traits that he's got. Oh yeah, he behaves that way because he's got ADD. What does that mean? No, ADD is just a category that bunches together a bunch of behaviors and symptoms and calls them a disease. But just because we called it a disease doesn't make it such. Something's going on in the mind of that person. Same with the oppositional child. Now, when we diagnose the child, think of it this way. If my foot was broken right now, would it make any difference to the brokenness of my bones whether or not I was here by myself or whether you're all here with me in this room? It wouldn't make any difference. That foot is broken. That's a disorder in my foot. The bones are fractured. But could I be oppositional if I was here by myself? Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, when you go home this afternoon, lock yourself into a room, make sure that you're by yourself and oppose somebody. And if you succeed in doing so, I hope you'll video it and put it on YouTube, because we all want to see how you oppose somebody when they're not there. In other words, oppositionality, by definition, implies a relationship. But if oppositionality defines a relationship, then why are we diagnosing the kid? instead of trying to examine their relationship? Why are we diagnosing and medicating the kid instead of looking at that child's relationships to the environment? So that's the perspective. And in two of my books, including the one I wrote together with Gordon, I use the epigraph by the great spiritual teacher Krishnamurti, who said, "Action has meaning only in relationship, and without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict." Without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. So if you just remember that one phrase, because it's always about, what do we do? Well, that's a fair enough question, but it has to be put into the context of the relationship. So with that in mind then, as parents and as child workers and whoever we are in our role in relationship to kids, we are the most important determinants of what happens with them. And that means that the first thing we have to be aware of is, what do we bring to the relationship? What do we bring to the particular interaction? Now, the mother who talked about the child not putting her coat on so that they had to leave without her, that's great. But it would not have been great if she had punished the child, if she had been angry with the child. What she said to the child was, "Listen, this is really too bad. I'd like to have gone with you, and I know that you're upset, but we couldn't because your jacket wasn't on. But let's go and have some fun together. Let's hang out together. Let's play." Now, in ordinary behavioral language, that would have been seen as rewarding the bad behavior. And yet it was just the opposite. It was actually a way of teaching discipline. Because if you look at the word discipline, what does it mean? What is a disciple? Somebody who follows, somebody who learns. You want our kid to be your disciple. This way of doing it, the kid learned. Had you punished the kid would not have learned. She just would have been felt rejected and hurt. So that parenting episode illustrates the importance of the relationship. You didn't focus on the behavior. The behavior had its natural consequence. You didn't have to impose it. But the relationship was kept safe and supportive. And that's what allowed the child to learn. Now, human beings can be in three modes in relationship to an environmental challenge. Three modes physiologically, three modes neurologically. And this follows the evolutionary ladder. Our most primitive and basic way of responding to an environmental challenge is immobilization. We just freeze. And that's the reptilian response. That's part of our reptilian brain. We have this part of our brain as we share with reptiles. And that part of the brain just freezes us. So we go immobilized in response to a threat. And we dissociate. Now the second response, which is a mammalian response, is more evolved, is to hypermobilize. And that's the flight or fight response. That's that adrenaline and cortisol response where you can fight back or escape. And that's mobilization. But both of those are defensive modes. And no learning happens. You don't learn much when you're being defended. The cell and the whole organism can be either in defensive mode or growth mode, but not both at the same time. There's a third mode, which is more sophisticated, which again uses entirely different nerves, entirely different brain centers, and different response patterns. And that's called the social engagement mode. So that we have the reptilian immobilization, the mammalian hypermobilization, and then you have the higher mammalian primate social engagement mode. In the social engagement mode, you actually look at somebody in the eye, you take in their facial expression, you listen to their voice, you respond with modulation of your own voice. So it's a totally different set of nerves. Only in the social engagement mode does learning actually happen. A lot of the kids who are having learning difficulties never get to the social engagement mode. They're stuck in the immobilization or hypermobilization mode. Why? Because to be in the social engagement mode, you have to have a sense of safety. Here in the brain, in the temporal lobe, there are probably sensors called neuroceptors. It's not perception, it's neuroception, because it's unconscious. The nerve centers here are picking up the level of safety. The more safety there is, the more you relax, the more you can learn. When you're in a state that either there is genuine threat or you perceive that as a threat, you're mobilized or immobilized. And then you're not learning, you're just trying to survive. That means that our task as parents, teachers, childcare workers, is to create that sense of safety for children so they can be in that social engagement mode. And then then they can learn from the negative example. That kid in this example here would not have learned a thing if she was put into the hypermobilization or immobilization defensive modes. She learned because she felt safe. That's why the thing didn't happen again. That's why that behavior did not recur. So when you have all these troubled kids who keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, doesn't matter how many times you tell them, it's because they're not in that social engagement mode. They're not in a state where they can learn. And I think as Gordon says, I don't know if you heard it yesterday, he says, if you've told a kid 1,000 times not to do something and they still keep doing it, who's got the learning problem here? So we're the ones that have to learn. When things aren't working, we're the ones that have to learn. We're the ones that have to figure out what's going on. And yes, we have to feel our frustration and our sadness. Now, if that South African couple could be brought to their sadness, so they actually feel their sadness, could have their tears about how it's not going well with their child, they could actually learn something. But for them to get to that sense of sadness, if they can get there at all, they have to feel really safe, really understood. It may or may not get them there. It depends how defended they are. But it's their only chance. It's their only chance of learning anything. And if that's true for us adults, it's even more so for our kids. Which again brings me to that point, back to my point, that first we have to take care of ourselves. And we have to consider our own states of mind and what's happening with us before we interact with kids. Which is a challenge, because kids are constantly challenging us, and they're triggering us, and they're pushing our buttons. And nobody's as effective in pushing your buttons than your child is. Which means that we have to be all the more responsible for ourselves. So it's with that in mind that I'm going to invite you to join me in a 7-minute mindful awareness exercise. So I'm going to ask you to put your pens and pencils down. And to sit on your chair with your feet on the ground so that you're grounded. And in a moment, we'll put some music on. Now, the music has no religious significance. I played the same music in Tulsa, Oklahoma 2 days ago, and they're a bit worried that I was trying to convert them to Hinduism, and I really wasn't. But the song is in Sanskrit, so they really, it was a bit... So I'm explaining to you. I'm not trying to convert you to anything, okay? It's just chanting music with the meditative intent. So your feet are on the ground, your hands are on your lap, or one on top of the other with your thumbs touching. Your back is straight, if that's comfortable for you. So don't slouch back or forward, but be comfortable, that's the main thing. Eyes closed. And just concentrate on your breath. And whatever thoughts come up for you, notice them, let them go, come back to the breath. In and out, and let that be your mindfulness practice, is just to be aware of the breath here. And let's see what your experience is. So Constantine, if you put track 2 on now. So I urge you to keep coming back to yourself in your work, in your parenting, because it begins here. It begins right in here. And what we don't deal with in ourselves, we pass on to our kids. And I can certainly tell you that, and you'll hear more about that later, but if there's one thing I could do over again in my life, if I could, it would be my parenting. It'd be how I lived my life when my kids were small. And what my concerns were and what they ought to have been. And how I took care of my mental health or how I didn't. Had a huge impact on the development of my children. And I say that not with blaming myself or any other parent, but just the more aware we are of that, the more mindful we can be of what it takes to stay balanced and the importance of it. Let me illustrate that for you. And by the way, I know that right now you're all sitting there full of perturbation and worried, Gil, you've screwed up your kids, right? This is what you're thinking. Don't worry about it, you have. We all do, But as a therapist once said to me, if your parents give you this much crap, and you give your kids only this much, you've done a great job. Okay. At Johns Hopkins University, they looked at medical students, and these were all middle class, all white, and largely all male. This study began in the 1940s, I think. And one of the questions they were asked, these medical students, intelligent, successful male, middle class students, is how close they felt to their parents. Those students on whose interviews in their 19, 20, or 21, 22 years of age revealed less than normal relationships, closeness with their parents. By middle age, they were more likely to commit suicide, to develop mental illness, or to suffer from high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, or cancer. In a similar study, Harvard undergraduates were interviewed about their perception of parental caring. 35 years later, these subjects' health were reviewed. By midlife, only a quarter of those students who reported high positive perceptions of parental caring were sick. By comparison, almost 90% of those who regarded their parental emotional nurturing negatively were ill. The researchers said, simple and straightforward ratings of feelings of being loved are significantly related to health status in adults. A study recently showed that the children of divorces have double the stroke risk 60 years later. Now, this is not about that there shouldn't be divorces, but what is it about divorces that stresses the kid? And how can we minimize those stresses? So that what happens significantly as long-term consequences, not just in the generation being affected, but in future generations. These problems that we're dealing with, mental illness, ADHD, physical disease, these are multi-generational. They don't start with an individual, they don't end with an individual. So, some of you may have heard of this experiment called the Strange experiment, where at 1 year of age, infants are brought into a laboratory with their mothers, and they interact and play for a while. And then a stranger comes in. It's called the Strange situation. And then a stranger comes in, and then the mother goes out after a while, and the child stays there with the stranger, and then the mother comes back in. So that's called the Strange situation. And what it reveals is the child's attachment. And there are secure patterns of attachment and insecure patterns of attachment. In fact, there's a secure pattern and then several insecure patterns. Now, the secure patterns is that naturally when the mother leaves and the stranger is left there with the child, that child should feel upset. And when the mother comes back, in a secure attachment, the child immediately goes to the mother and for soothing, and is very quickly and readily soothed by the mother, and is able to go off and play independently in the mother's presence. In the insecure attachments, the child either won't come to the mother or is not be able to soothe by the mother. And those are called forms of insecure attachments. And the researchers had observed these children interacting with their mothers in the home prior to the strange experiment. And those mothers that really connected with their kids emotionally and were tuned to the kids, those are the kids that showed secure attachments. And mothers that were stressed or distracted, their kids showed the insecure attachments. You understand? We're not talking about whether a mother loves the child or not. It's not a question that one group of mothers love their kids more than the other group. It's a question of how emotionally present was the mother. Now, that's predictable and straightforward enough. There's another test called the adult attachment interview. This is where you ask adults to talk about their childhood attachments and to their parents. And not so much the narrative that they tell, but how they tell it reveals the sense of security or lack of it in their adult attachments. Here's the part that's revealing. So you can tell the degree of attachment of an adult that they had with their parents. Now you can do an adult attachment interview with an adult before they have children. And the degree of security or lack of it that they reveal on the adult attachment interview will reliably predict what their yet unconceived child will display at the 1-year strange situation. They don't have kids yet, but by the way they were attached to their parents, that'll predict how their child will attach by the time the child is 1 year old. And how the child performs on the 1-year-old strange situation will be a good predictor of how good they will be in school and how well behaved they will be, and what kind of information they'll convey on the adult attachment into you 25 years later. So what we're talking about is multi-generational effects here. We pass this on. Now, the great British psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott said that 2 things can go wrong in childhood. When things happen that shouldn't happen. That's one. So, in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where I worked with a heavily addicted population, there was nobody I worked with who had not been abused as a child. All those people had been severely traumatized as kids. The women were all sexually abused. Many of the men were neglected, abandoned, beaten, emotionally traumatized. That's what I mean by things happening that shouldn't happen. But the other thing Winnicott says that can go wrong is when things don't happen that should happen. And that is that secure attachment with the parents. So, there's an American researcher, Dr. Myron Hoffer, who said, well, let me just quote to you if I can find his words. Here it is. He's the director of the Division of Developmental Psychobiology at Columbia University, and he wrote in 1996, "The paradox remains," he said, "how could the absence of something or somebody create such disturbances? There must be a biology of loss, and we must find it." Well, in fact, we have found it. There's a biology of loss. So there's not just a biology of trauma, which is clear enough, and I'll tell you about it after the break, but there's also a biology of loss. And our task, again, as parents and all those of us involved with the care of children, is to avoid that biology of loss, or when it has occurred, to correct it. And that happens through relationship. Because the loss happened in relationship. Okay? So, this would be it's about 18 minutes to 1 o'clock now. This might be a good time to pause and see if there's any questions or comments at all.
If a child is severely traumatized...
I'm sorry, say again?
If a child is severely traumatized...
Yeah.
Is it possible to do that healing as an adult?
Yeah, well, the good news is that yes. I would have said this later, but it's a good time to say it now because it's important, so thanks for the question. Dr. Marian Diamond in Berkeley, California, in the 1980s, experimented with rats. And she took rats at different ages, young rats and old rats, adult rats. And she even took some baby rats and deliberately damaged their brains. Deliberately damaged their brains. And then she exposed these rats at different ages, and even the traumatized ones, to different levels of environmental stimulation. So some got better social contact, more toys to play with and all that. After a couple of months, the rats at any level, at any age, brain damaged or not, who had received the better stimulation, were better able to find their way out of a maze. When you autopsied their brains, in the front part of the brain, there was larger nerve cells with more connections to other nerve cells and richer blood supply. In other words, the environmental enrichment actually enriched the physiology of the frontal cortex of their brain, which is where behavior is controlled, is in the frontal cortex. And so Dr. Diamond said, you never give up on any human being. So that's the good news here. Whereas if you have this genetic perspective, you're kind of doomed, aren't you? Because you're not going to change anybody's genes. But, as I'll tell you after the break, genes are actually turned on and off by the environment. Okay? So yes, there's this capacity for new development called neuroplasticity. You've all heard of the book called The Brain That Changes Itself. Neuroplasticity is the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits even later on in life. So if we see problems as diseases, genetic diseases, that doesn't allow you to work with it very much. But if you recognize that all these issues that we're dealing with in kids, whether it's autism, whether it's ADHD, whether it's depression, whether it's behavior issues, oppositionality, conduct disorders, they're just problems of development because the conditions for development were a bit stressed. Then we can ask the question, well, how do you promote development even later? And that has to do with the circumstances we give kids. So it's a more difficult perspective for parents, but it's also much more optimistic. It opens up many more possibilities. Yes, please.
Hi, Dr. Mate. Just a question. You're talking about the, the multi-generational component of, and in terms of addiction in particular.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question. Knowing that there's a legacy for children to then kind of adopt some of these addictions. So a mother has an addiction, the children then have an addiction. Mm-hmm. If the children are able to work through their own attachments and things to get healthy, is there a way to rebuild the kind of overall family, even if the matriarch and patriarch of the family don't do that kind of learning? I'm not sure if my question is clear.
You're asking, is there hope for the children? The mother
or the family. Like, can the family do it?
A family can with the right support. In other words, it doesn't matter what happened, because how shall I say this to you? The fundamental problem is not what happened 20 years ago, or what happened 50 years ago or 15 years ago. That's not what went wrong. In other words, the real problem is not that there was trauma. The real problem is, how did that affect a child's perception of themselves and their relationship to the world? If the problem was what happened 15 years ago or 50 years ago, there's nothing you can do about that. You can't even do anything about what happened 5 minutes ago or 5 seconds ago. Never mind what happened 50 years ago.
Sure.
But how you perceive yourself and how you perceive the world, those are in the present. And that we can work with. So the answer is very much yes.
Even when the parents continue to not...
Even when the parents continue to engage in their addictive behaviors.
That can be approached from a point of compassion, empathy, grace, those kinds of things? Or do we do separation?
Just take away the question mark, okay?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you.
They can be approached from a point of view of compassion, empathy, and grace, yes. You said it. Just take away the question mark.
Many people have very different points of view.
I know, they're nuts.
They say divide and conquer. They are.
Listen, the reason Gordon and I make such a good living is because the world is nuts. You know, sometimes I joke with them. I say, you know what, do you realize we're getting paid all this money just because there's so much nonsense out there? If people actually saw the truth, we'd be out of a job.
Well, you know, I feel very fortunate. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I don't mean to be dismissive, but the ideology of behaviorism or disease is so deeply entrenched in our society. And the mind-body separation is so firmly established in medical thinking. And not only do we separate the mind from the body, we separate the individual from the environment. So we think that all these problems like cancer and depression and ADHD or whatever it is, these are all individual problems. They're not. They're problems of a system. And of course there's a great social, ideological benefit to thinking that things are diseases, for example. Because if things are inherited diseases, like the addiction that you just asked about, then we don't have to ask ourselves, then why is it that First Nations people in Canada make up 5% of our population, but 50% of our prison population? Well, it's just the genes. And we don't have to actually say what happened to those people. And we don't have to look at the trauma that was inflicted upon them. And we don't have to look at the trauma that continues to be inflicted upon them, because it's just the genes. So the reasons why these ideas are so powerful is because they have a socially conservative agenda behind it. And I don't mean a conscious one either, but it's there. So that's what we're up against here. Yeah, not to mention the fact that the medical research is funded by people with the money. And who have the money? The pharmaceutical companies. So in the Globe and Mail today, there's a review of a new book called Pharmageddon, which is the power of the pharmaceutical companies. Now, I don't think it's a conspiracy, but they do conspire. They conspire all the time to lie to people about their drugs. And, of course, their studies appear in the medical journals. Now, nobody's going to make a buck off attachment. You can't market it. You can't put it into a pill. And it's much more complex. So, for somebody to stand up here and say, well, the thing with the bullies is you have to isolate the bully and really punish them, that's a lot more easy and that's more emotionally satisfying than to listen to Gordon and say that the bully is a hurt, sensitive, emotionally shut down individual who's acting out certain attachment dynamics. It's a lot easier to go the behavioral route. It's also completely useless. So in one study of the zero tolerance approach to bullying, the title was Zero Tolerance, Zero Evidence. But that's all right. When I arrived in Toronto yesterday, I picked up in the back of the taxi cab, there was this Toronto Sun newspaper. And they were talking about the proposition that there ought to be a supervised injection site in Toronto to help drug addicts, such as I used to work at in Vancouver. And this columnist says, you know, well, there's a much better approach, abstinence. Okay, sure, buddy. If you can teach abstinence to a lot of people overnight, go ahead and do it. But meanwhile, shut the hell up, because you don't know what you're talking about. But the opinion makers and the politicians don't have the duty that I as a physician do, which is that I have to base everything I tell you on evidence. They can say whatever they want, and nobody's asking them to back it up with any kind of evidence. So it's not so much that people are nuts, you see, it's just that the consciousness of these issues in our society is so skewed. And attachment, although it's obvious when you speak about it, it's so much more complex that people stay away from that complexity.
I just had a comment to make. I'm a probation officer, and I work with kids. And I just find that there's not more kids going into the facilities. there's less, but the kids that are getting there have more issues,
Yeah,
more severe issues, more violence, more abandonment, more
Yeah.
trauma, more
yeah,
low self-esteem, and relationship issues
yeah,
and attachment
Yeah.
issues. And I find it disturbing that the social programs are being cut back or what have you. And also, I think that they're missing a big piece, is that we're dealing with the youth and their behavior. And we don't have the capacity or the mandate to work with the parents
yeah.
who have parented this child.
Who are very often themselves traumatized as kids. So they're just passing on their trauma to their children, yeah.
You speak a lot about consciousness, and I really appreciate that the time you had us to sit and reflect.
Okay.
Because I think it's so important for us to kind of take that look inside.
Yeah.
And then from an evolutionary perspective, because you talk about the multi-generations it takes to create or prevent disease. When we're talking about raising children, we would have a traditional, if we look at a traditional community, much like the Aboriginal communities were, everyone participated in that.
That's right.
Opportunity to nurse, to guide, to nurture, to correct the child, all of the children. But now, the kind of parenting and roles we have are very isolated. Families are very isolated.
Yes.
And if we were to think of what our responsibilities were, not only as parents, and I'm actually not a parent, nor do I work with children on a regular basis, but I treat parents.
Yes.
And I treat people who have been parented,
Yes.
much like myself.
Yes.
So how do we marry these ideas of a traditional community care system, which I think is so valuable, and the opportunity to evolve our consciousness around what it takes to care and to prevent and to correct disease? I just would like your comments on that.
Sure. Well, I mentioned to you that, I think I mentioned to you, or at least, or I thought about it, I forget which, this study from Notre Dame University that showed that the hunter-gatherer tribe is the optimal environment for parenting. Did I mention that? Okay, well it is. A study from Notre Dame University a year or two ago showed that the optimal environment for parenting is the hunter-gatherer tribe. And they looked at three features of what made those societies better environments for parenting. One of them was just what you mentioned, that children were surrounded by a whole network of attachment-oriented adults, and the kids were connected to many adults. Imagine how safe that made them feel in the world. Even if mom and dad screwed up, there was still uncle and aunt and grandmother and grandfather. So that there was a safe context, the attachment village, number one. Number two, positive contact. Now, that means these kids were held. Wherever the parents went, the kids went. It wasn't a question of parents going off to work and, these kids were always held by an adult. The papoose in native tradition. So positive touch. And they weren't hit. The third feature was when these kids cried, they were picked up. Now in our society, we tell parents, let him cry it out. Let him sleep into the night. If you pick him up, you'll just teach him to wake you up again. I used to tell parents this until I learned better. So don't pick them up. When you don't pick the child up, see, the child, as Gordon would have said to you yesterday, I'm sure, has only one basic way of connecting to the adult, and that's through physical contact, through the senses, by hearing you, touching you, smelling you, have to be held by you. When the child is crying, the child is not crying for frivolous reasons. They're expressing a need. The need could be strictly physical, like hunger or physical discomfort, or it could be just a need for emotional contact, to be held. Now, what happens to you when your needs are ignored? You get stressed. That's what stress is when something that the organism thinks it needs is not provided. That's the biology of loss. The child who's not picked up when they're crying, their brain releases stress hormones, their adrenal gland, and their brains release stress hormones, and their brains are overwhelmed by stress. When the brain is overwhelmed by stress, the brain doesn't develop properly, as I'll tell you after the lunch break. So from the point of view of neurobiology, they got it and we don't. Now your question is, how do we recreate that? Well, let's defer that question for later, but let's be aware of the importance of it, so that we're not going to go back to the hunter-gatherer tribe. I mean, we're not going to do that in North York, Ontario. But let's look at what we've lost and what can we do to replace what we've lost to the extent that we can. Okay? Now, any other questions before the break?
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.